One thing, again, when assessing the size of the financial sector is, and its appropriateness is sort of the allocation of society's resources. Have too much resources gone into financial innovation, which could have been otherwise deployed to other activities? Now, in saying that, it should be borne in mind that some of the financial innovations that we've seen over the past 2,000 years or so have probably been beneficial. So some financial innovations are good, some of them not necessarily so, but that's true of any sector of the economy. To some extent it might matter a bit more with the financial sector given the place that it sits in the economy, but it's again something which happens right across the economy. In terms of looking at ways which one might go about resolving these issues, one issue which I think is not dissimilar to something that John raised, and is raised I think in more detail in his paper, is the prospect of having higher capital provision or capital charges for risky activities. And to some extent, if the capital charges are high enough, then an institution which indulges or partakes in too much of those risky activities may have an incentive to be smaller than it otherwise would be. So, which is another way of, it's a tax on the provision of those services. One point which John did talk about today was making sure there are sharp boundaries between publicly supported and unsupported institutions, which I think in principle is very fine. I think the difficult problem that we have to address as policymakers is how to put that in place in practice. If you think about the 70s and the 80s in the Australian context, and John mentioned the case of the Bank of Adelaide, is that to a large extent those innovations were occurring outside the regulatory net, and to some extent the linkages between those inside the regulatory net and those outside the regulatory net are not all that clear until they become clear because you've got a problem. And making sure that those linkages aren't there is a difficult problem because there's always an incentive to arbitrage around that. That said, just because it's a difficult problem means you don't have to try and address it. So things, one of the objections raised to the Tobin tax, for instance, is that, oh well, and John mentions this, is that if it wasn't implemented in every single country in the world, you'd see the whole of financial services shift to the Cayman Islands or the like where this wasn't there. And that argument, I think, can always be put in the way of any regulatory change, but to some extent, if you're throwing sand in the wheels, then some of the sand is probably going to slow things down. Yes, it's not going to be completely effective. The car's probably still going to keep on driving, but and there's always going to be regulatory arbitrage, but that doesn't mean you don't contemplate these sort of things. I think a more difficult question to answer is sort of what is systemically important, because to some extent that's very time varying. At the moment, it's almost the case that any financial institution is systemically important because if we have another reasonable financial collapse, there's probably panic is going to set in again and we'll be back where we were in October, which is a month I don't particularly want to revisit again. And if you think about it, if you were sitting there at the beginning of 2007 and you asked people in the UK, was Northern Rock a systemically important institution, most people probably would have said no, it's not. But come sort of mid to late 2007, it turned out it was a systemically important institution. So it partly depends on the circumstances, and the circumstances tend to change reasonably quickly. So being able to answer that question, I think, is a difficult question. It doesn't mean you don't ask the question, but I think, as in all of these things, the answer is a lot harder than the question. That said, I would like to highlight one point John made, which is the important role of government as a provider of public insurance. And you see that across a whole set of dimensions in terms of the social safety net. And Australia, by and large, has a pretty good social safety net. If you compare that to China, where the social safety net is nowhere near as developed as it is here, that has serious consequences for household behaviour. For instance, the high rate of saving in China has a lot to do with the fact that that there isn't much of a social safety net in place and there isn't much of a health safety net in place. To some extent it'll be interesting to see what happens in the US at the moment in the sense that their social safety net is to some extent not as well developed, is not the right word, but it's not as comprehensive as it is here, both in terms of unemployment and also in terms of health. And the government does serve an important role as a collective risk manager and handle things like intergenerational transfers probably better than nearly everyone nearly any other institution we have around. But to some extent, and I think part of the sort of progression that John mentioned between the sort of 70s and where we are today in terms of the role of the government in the economy, to some extent reflects the influence of economic ideas. It also, I think, to some extent reflects the preferences of the median voter. Now, I can sit here, throughout my whole life, I will never be the median voter. I'm in that generation, which is unfortunately screwed by the people sitting at this table, who are, throughout their whole life, the median voter. So the baby boomers are the median voter pretty much their whole life, but I'm unfortunately a member of Generation X who is, throughout the first part of my working life, we paid down the public debt in this country. By the time I get towards the end of my working life, I'll be paying off the pensions of the baby boomers. By the time I actually get to be on the pension, assuming I'm ever allowed to retire, Generation Y, who's actually, there are more of them than there are of me, will be coming along and reducing my pension. So the students of today won't have this problem because you'll be in Generation Y, there'll be more of you than there are of me. And let me just finally talk a little bit about the current account, which John talked about. I don't see it quite as the vulnerability to the country that John does. It's not something that we ignore, but I don't see it as quite the vulnerability that he does. By and large, I think it reflects a desire to invest in Australia because of the future prospects that the global community sees in the country and the future income growth that the global community sees in this country. As John said, though, that means that that assessment needs to be maintained to keep the funds flowing this way. But that said, we have had, over the past 15 years, fairly sizable swings in the current account deficit in this country. For instance, just over 12 months ago, it was about over 7% of GDP. Today, it's about 1.5% of GDP. So we've had a major swing in the size of the current account without a particularly large disruption to the local economy. And in fact, if you go back to the early 2000s, where the current account again swung from about 6.5%, 7% of GDP down to 2% of the GDP, and basically no one really noticed. So I think to some extent the flexibility we have in the country nowadays allows us to adjust to those swings without too much drama. The other point about current accounts deficits is that by and large someone has to run a current account deficit. So when I was at the IMF, it used to be quite interesting because you see the recommendation, so you used to work on particular countries at the IMF, and every economist who worked on a particular country would say that this country's current account deficit would have to be smaller, or this country's current account surplus had to be larger. But there's a bit of a fallacy of composition here, that you can't have every country run a smaller current account deficit because someone has to actually be on the other side of that. So one thing that I don't know, maybe hopefully you still get taught this in university economics, is about the value of portfolio diversification. Well, if you want to diversify your portfolio across the globe, that actually means money needs to flow from one place to another. And it probably means, given that, say, if you compare Australia versus Japan, where the future income and growth prospects here are probably better than they are in Japan, that it's probably going to be the case that we're going to be running a current account deficit and they're probably going to be running a current account surplus. So to allow that sort of global portfolio diversification to occur, you do need to have cross-border capital flows, and you probably do need to have some countries running current account deficits and some countries running current account surpluses. Just as within a country, you have some households like me who have a mortgage, and you have people who have retired who probably don't have a mortgage, and the same thing sort of happens on a global scale.